It was a decision revising an exemption for the Opal pipeline. It should then endeavor to adhere to that principle. And here's the quote from paragraph 73 of that ruling, so that it seems to impose quite a heavy duty on both the Commission and the Member States to take decisions having the spirit of solidarity in mind. And so what does that mean? That's something we're going to talk about, but maybe just on the last slide, the judgment goes on and it says, well, there must be a balance of interests. So the idea is you have to weigh this, or the Commission or the Member State must weigh up the interests to try to address the conflicts issue. Is that a procedural test only, or is it something more? Now, of course, there is an appeal against this ruling of the General Court that's pending at the moment, and Martin will be able to bring us up to speed on what's happening there, not the actual arguments that are being made, but at least I think he'll brief us on the process and where we are and when we can perhaps expect an Advocate General's opinion and eventually a ruling. So thinking about this concept of solidarity, is it useful? There are some pros and some cons, which I think we'll come back to in this discussion. And some of the pros, you could say, well, we live in an interdependent market, so the principle of solidarity reflects that reality. And because we're so interdependent and interlinked, then solidarity is a must. But there might be some disadvantages. It might mean more centralization of power, move power to the EU level away from the member states. One could say it's creating legal obligations on the basis of a principle, but we don't have any clear rules yet as to how we exercise or implement this principle. And of course, energy security is a concept that has been debated for many, many decades, and we don't really know what it means. So with that in mind, with these background thoughts, I now turn to the panel. And I'd like, first of all, to ask Marcin maybe to bring us up to date on where we are in the process. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Lee. I'm not Marcin, but Dirk, and I would like to welcome you also on our behalf here at the Energy Community in Vienna. We all got used to this webinar type of conferences. We had plenty of time to get used to it. I very much hope, and I'm confident that we will also get used to meeting each other again. That will be next year here in Vienna. Everything is prepared, and we do hope that we will bridge that time by an interesting series of webinars. The first one deals with this very crucial aspect of the Green Deal, that is the just transition. And indeed, thank you, Lee, for setting the scene. I remember last year when we met here in Vienna, we already discussed the Opal case, and we asked ourselves the question whether this is another Costa NL moment in the development of European energy law. So the operationalization of the solidarity principle through a judgment by the General Court. And evidently, we will devote some part of the discussion on this operationalization or juridification of a principle which sounded indeed more like poetry when it was put there in that Article 194. And in that respect, a first question that we would like to ask all panelists, but I believe that Marcin is the best place to give his first answer, is indeed, how's your reading of this judgment? Especially, and I would like to channel the discussion a little bit into the principle of energy sovereignty. Lee already mentioned it, energy security, energy sovereignty. There's been a lot of theoretical battles fought about that. We saw Article 194 is the solidarity principle, maybe the last nail in the coffin of another principle, energy sovereignty of member states, which has been put into Article 194, but has suffered already a lot through EU policy aspects such as renewables, such as ETS, such as the creation of an internal market, for example. Marcin, what's your reading of Opal in that respect?
Thank you, Dirk. In fact, it's a very interesting question, and the answer is not that easy. So for me, the easiest will be to confront the 2 points of view: the point of view of Germany and the point of view of Poland, presented in the under appeal in the current proceeding. So I will very briefly present what is the argumentation of Germany and what is the argumentation of Poland under the appeal, and then I will give you a little update regarding where we are in the proceeding from the procedural point of view. So generally, the German reading of the Opel case is that solidarity principle is not a self-standing legal criterion. It's not a general principle of EU law. There are no rights or obligation, Germany says, that come from that principle. It's more like a purely political concept. The EU solidarity from the Germany point of view is more like a political rhetoric, deprived of any normative content. To get this normative content, we need to have a secondary legislation. So what Germany say is that the solidarity principle is only a political declaration, and the legal criterion may be given to that declaration only after being defined, concretized by the act of secondary legislation, which establish the concrete rights and obligations. Moreover, Germany says that the principle of solidarity, energy solidarity, is addressed only to the EU legislator, because, just like I mentioned, the only rights and obligations come from the secondary law. So only the Council and the Parliament are bounded with this principle. So this principle, according to Germany, is not binding the executive institutions of the EU, like Commission. It's not binding for the ACER, for example, and it's not binding for the member states or its institutions, like, for example, regulatory authorities. Germany see this principle in the context of energy security more like a chains that bound the member states in providing the energy security on their territory. In contrary, Poland see the energy solidarity as a specific expression of the general principle of solidarity between member states. So it's more, we should read this principle more in the line of obligation of sincere cooperation, as it was established in Article 4, Para 3 of the treaty. So it's a principle that bound all the institutions, all the member states, and all the entities, and it ensure, from one side, just like the principle of sincere cooperation, it wants us, institutions and member states, to ensure fulfillment of EU law, and from the other hand, refrain from any actions, any measures that may jeopardize, that may be dangerous for the union's objectives under the EU policy. So, summing up, from our point of view, this solidarity principle have to be applied on all levels of EU cooperation, between the institutions, between institutions and member states, and finally between the member states. So I just show you what are the rights between the rights between the parties, and justification of the two parties, conflicted parties, position. So just to let you be more updated with the procedural stage. I just wanted to say that after Germany submitted the appeal, Poland replied with statement of defense. Right after Germany decided not to present the applicant's reply. So there was also no rejoinder from Polish side. So in fact, after the German decision not to present the applicant's reply, we have finalized the written part of the procedure. The Commission didn't decide to intervene in this case. Latvia and Lithuania are the interveners to support the Polish position. So right now we'll be waiting for the Advocate General opinion if the court will apply for it, will ask for it. There was no motions for the oral hearing from the sides, from the parties. So we don't know if the court also will ask for the oral hearing. It will organize oral hearing. If not, we believe that the judgment in the appeal will be delivered by the council, by the court very soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marcin, for this really interesting insight in how different countries position themselves. Maybe if we take this topic, which is evidently has become a legal topic, but behind it is also a political difference in understanding what solidarity means. I'd like to pose two brief questions, and maybe we give also other panelists the possibility to enter here, and Marcin, of course, again as well. But this solidarity principles, is it maybe an East-West issue in the end? Is it something that has come up with enlargement and is kind of a legacy issue of enlargement? I'd also be interested very much in hearing Andris Piebalg's opinion on this. And a related question, B, is it still something that we discuss as we were still living in a Westphalian legal international law order? That means solidarity is a principle of between member states, between countries, essentially. Is it about time as well, maybe to translate this principle of solidarity to relations between individuals and their countries, or between individuals and individuals? To what kind of relevance does solidarity has below the surface of the individual states? That's a question, or two questions I would like to ask the panel. Maybe, I don't know, Andris, would you start?
Yeah, sure, Dirk. So thank you. It's really fascinating subject. Yeah, Marcin made very clear what the cases, how the case is being looked from German side and also from Polish side. And for me, the court decision was actually very correct, because if something is in the law, primary law, well, it should be interpreted one way or another. If it's because it says in a spirit of solidarity, and then you come to internal market, you come to issue for security of supply. So in this respect, I would say it's quite a logical conclusion of the movements that we have seen already for some time in the Union. There have been times when on EU level we took one decision, and then member countries negotiated agreements with other countries against EU law. And then there was a later of disappointment when the EU said, well, it's against the law we have. So in a way, solidarity principle goes in this direction. Whenever you take decision, you should really take care what impact makes it on others. So it goes only so far, and that is a fair principle, because you could build a nuclear power station on the border. It's your sovereign right, but you need to also to say, well, what impact will make it on another country. So it seems rather simple. Well, let's see how the appeal will go. But I would not describe it East-West issue. Yes, there is a well, historical legacies that Eastern countries more exposed to security of supply problems. But it could be in any part of the Union when decision is being taken, substantial decision on energy investments that affect neighbor countries. So it is not East-West issue. I would definitely would not say. And I would say also what, Dirk, your second question, we should not try to, in secondary legislation, to explain everything and everywhere. When situation comes, then there is appeal or there is a decision to go to European Court, and then we have a case law. So I think that clarifies better than if we will try to describe everything, because then we will come in the definitions that perhaps wouldn't mean anything. Here, at least, the meaning is very clear. And I would say it has a rather positive meaning, and perhaps we would avoid some political problems if such a situation have been before, like Union divided about Nord Stream 2, because Nord Stream 2 poses such a harm in political division between member countries that perhaps we would have avoided it.
Very much. Maybe we continue discussing indeed these particular aspects of the solidarity principle. Andres, if I may summarize, or if I understood you correctly, you said that the solidarity principle, first of all, is a requirement for an impact assessment. So you have to take into account what kind of measures are being taken and what kind of effect they may have on your neighbors. Then we have the two positions by the parties to the case that Marcin has summarized. And then I try to add also another dimension which would go below the relations between states and between states and European Union institutions, but would also involve maybe private citizens or NGOs, civil society. I was always asking myself, what would it mean in the case of Opal, for example, to take into account the interests of Poland as a member state, or vice versa, Germany or any of the neighbors there? What does it mean, the interests of a state? Who defines in the 21st century the interests of a state? Let's see who else from the panel would like to get into this discussion about the heart and soul of the solidarity principle.
Dirk, if I may, perhaps less on the legal interpretation of the solidarity principle, but on the particular case which this panel is also discussing, of just transition, and how what we are doing right now in Europe on just transition is in the end expressing how Europe sees solidarity among member states, but also among regions. So that would take me to the two questions that you asked, essentially about which level of solidarity are we talking about, and is it an East-West divide? When we started working on coal regions in transition in the European Union in 2017, we discovered that the transition of coal regions, unlike perhaps some opinions that could have circulated around this subject before, is not really an East-West divide. We have met with stakeholders in a number of coal regions, be it Greece, Spain, Germany, which actually encountered similar challenges to the stakeholders that are based in Jiu Valley in Romania, in Silesia in Poland, or in Marica in Bulgaria. And so on this specific, I would say, issue on how to tackle transition away from coal, which I think is one of the big challenges from the energy sector perspective, at least ahead of a number of member states. This goes well beyond the East-West divide, because you have these what we call pockets of statistical poverty or vulnerability that can be hiding within the regions that, statistically speaking, are looking as they are quite well off. But these regions are facing specific challenges, and that's why, as part of the European Green Deal, one of the priorities of the Executive Vice President was to establish a just transition fund and a just transition mechanism, because as it has also been shown in the impact assessment for the 2030 climate targets, the coal industry will be the one that is affected to a big extent. And when we say industry, we say all the communities that actually benefit from these jobs. And I think that the just transition case shows us a very a very interesting laboratory of what solidarity means in practice, also talking about these various levels of intervention, as you said, because we're not talking only about solidarity between member states, we're also talking about the regional perspective, and going even under the regional perspective and talking about the community perspective. Because I'm sure some of the participants are familiar in the Just Transition Fund. We are tackling so-called NUTS 3, so the level below the regions, not only the regional perspective, but also the perspective of sub-regions. So I think we have here a very interesting question from a policy perspective on how to operationalize the solidarity and going beyond the legal principles, and how to make sure that the EU citizens actually see the solidarity happening in practice. And definitely one of the aims of the Just Transition Fund is to demonstrate that Europe is solidary also with the regions that are finding this transition perhaps a little bit more challenging or have a different starting point, just to broaden a little bit beyond the legal discussions.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra, not only for taking us outside the strict realm of the law, but also for indeed bringing this discussion to the citizens and making solidarity, or showing the dimension of solidarity also when it comes to citizens. And as we are indeed not limiting ourselves anymore to a strictly legal and strictly states or institution-related principle of solidarity, I'd also like to get Stefan into this discussion. To what extent is solidarity, let's say, so the principle of solidarity matters when it comes to addressing energy poverty as a phenomenon which deserves and has already gotten greater attention now under the Green Deal? Is supporting energy poverty, is that a matter of solidarity? And if yes, how can we do it in Europe in that spirit of solidarity?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. I was particularly intrigued to see how you've brought in the principle of solidarity into the debate. I have to say, as someone who's been working in this field for a while, one of our biggest challenges has been moving the question of energy poverty beyond energy policy, which it rightfully should be. It has entered the EU debate through energy policy, particularly through energy efficiency policy, whereas it is very much a question of housing and social policy, or for that matter, health policy. What has really stopped us from bringing in wider debates and getting a wider range of stakeholders, or for that matter, regulation and policy, into the European level has been the principle of subsidiarity. So there is a clash between subsidiarity and solidarity here. And member states have been extremely resistant towards anything that might be seen as, from the European level, as taking away their competencies. And this has been particularly the case with member states that have very strong traditions and very strong institutions in the domain of social policy, particularly in Scandinavia, but also member states like Germany and so on. So one of the biggest obstacles traditionally towards stronger EU energy policy in the sort of social domain have been those member states. Now, what does it mean if we're going to bring in the principle of solidarity? You can talk about so many different solidarities that become important. You have certainly social solidarity among citizens, and understanding that the costs of the transition are unequally distributed. So not just among regions, but primarily also among citizens through prices, but also through the ability to participate in these processes. And I think that's really important, because what we actually are seeing now is quite a lot of money being thrown at the transition, but not all citizens are able to participate in it equally. And this is one of our biggest challenges right now. The procedural mechanisms aren't there, but also the participatory mechanisms aren't there. And then on a more EU level, and I think there's a potential entry point here, is that when it comes to questions around energy inequality at the household scale, we have gigantic differences among member states. So we have some member states where these indicators for energy poverty are almost, I would say, negligible. We have what we call a residual socio-demographic profile of energy poverty, so 2 to 3% of the population, if so. Then we have other member states, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, but also the Baltics as well, Southern Europe. These sort of map onto wider geographical differences in Europe, but not necessarily always. We have member states where this percentage of energy poor citizens is over 20, 30%. So we have a pervasive issue of energy poverty, sometimes extending beyond income poverty. So I think there's an opening potentially here to think about solidarity, not just as social solidarity, but more broadly as a kind of a new form of cohesion policy, almost providing for geographical infrastructural cohesion beyond just social solidarity, where we kind of maybe can go around the subsidiarity principle, because energy poverty is structural. It has other consequences. It has consequences on political instability, on the ability to implement reforms, and so on. So solidarity among member states with regard to these huge energy inequalities and the involvement of the European Union in those solidarity principles makes or facilitates other policies at the EU level, including energy policies. It just makes everything a lot smoother and makes the transition smoother. So there's potentially an opening there. But I thought it was really interesting that you brought the question into the debate. Let's see how it develops.
Thanks a lot for this contribution, Stefan. It's interesting, I think, playing the ball back to Marcin, what kind of box you open there, Marcin. It's not only the legal principle, it's not only on the level between member states and institutions. We're talking social solidarity, cohesion policy. I think it is really, this principle evidently has a great potential, and that is makes our today's discussion even more important. Before we continue on the same and similar topics, I would remind everybody that we have a polling question related to solidarity, and that reads: do you think the spirit of solidarity is already, and now I can't read my own handwriting, but I don't have to, because here it is on the screen, should be used as a legal tool. Please participate actively and also influence those participating in the debate here, and maybe for them to take your answer home to the next decisions that they are taking. And while the poll is open, I think we can continue because this principle of solidarity is evidently we're only at the beginning of the discussions. I would like to take it into a direction that Alexandra has started taking us to, and that is the relevance of the principle of solidarity also when it comes to implementing the core objective of the Green Deal, and that is decarbonization. As we know, or at least as it looks like right now, is that decarbonization is a joint European endeavor and an objective and a target that we need to reach together. What kind of role does solidarity play? And this is probably against between states, but then also taking on board those who are not as favored as much as maybe the most blessed ones in our when wealth and privileges were distributed in our societies. What kind of role, maybe first on a state level, does solidarity play when it comes to reaching the 2030, but then of course also the 2050 targets? Marcin, maybe we start with you again. You said that the one of the readings of the solidarity principle is that it has to be translated into secondary legislation, or maybe not, or maybe both, but how to translate it best in secondary legislation, implementing the Green Deal? Do you think we are on a good path there?
Thank you, Dirk. Yeah, what comes from me, what is most important, and comes from the judgment, is that the solidarity principle is not anything new. It's just a concretization of a principle of sincere cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I wanted to say, that we need to read this verdict, this judgment, and this principle through the sincere cooperation. I wanted to, that's why I said that it have to be applied on all the levels. And I would like to, right now, I would like to focus on the level of obligation that comes from that judgment and comes from that that principle to the Commission in the process of legislation, because it's most important for me in the just transition to be the process to be absolutely transparent, absolutely clear, and based on the legal instruments, on the legal acts. As we got Alexandra today with us, who represent the Commissioner Timmermans, I thought that I will relate to one of the Commissioner Timmermans' babies from the previous Commission, which is the interinstitutional agreement on better lawmaking. The Commissioner Timmermans was, as the Vice President responsible for interinstitutional relations in the previous Commission, was the main negotiator from the Commission side on this agreement. This agreement is extremely important for the legislation in Europe because it gives a clear requirements for the clear requirements not only to the Commission but all the co-legislators in the process of legislation on the secondary legislation, and also to the Commission on the when the Commission is exercising their implementing rights. I have chosen 3 elements that I would like to mention today. The first is the choice of the legislative instruments. So the obligation for the Commission, when the Commission present its proposal, to explain and justify the legal basis and the type of used the legal act and the type of act they want to use. It's important because the solidarity principle do not change anything with the principle, with the or I would say right or maybe freedom of the member states to provide their own energy mix. This principle doesn't change it. So because the judgment of the court and this principle cannot change the Article 294 and 292 of the treaty, where this right, this freedom of the member states is clearly given to them. So when the Commission choose the legal act and the legal base for this act, the Commission have to be very careful, because the act and the legal base they propose may infringe the right of the member states to provide their energy mix on their own. So the effect of the act may infringe the Article 194 and 192. So in fact, the energy solidarity. The second element I wanted to mention is exercising the rights of the Commission to provide the implementing measures. After the Treaty of Lisbon, we know that we got a completely different system. We got delegated acts and implementing acts. So when the Commission proposed to give them in the legislative act, to give them the executive powers, it also have to be very careful which of them delegated or implementing act they propose, because the delegated act may only supplement or amend non-essential elements of the legislative acts. And if we will have a look, for example, on the proposal of the delegated acts under the taxonomy regulation, we'll clearly see that by by trying to define the technical screening criteria for environmental objectives, Commission may get into the member states' freedom to provide their energy mix, because the delegated act proposal, it seems like it's trying to eliminate the support for natural gas investments in gas infrastructure. So so this element also have to be always taken into account. The last one, and right now I will refer also to what Alexandra said before. The last element is the impact assessment. In 2005, Skinner and Arnott wrote a very interesting book about energy security. They said that when thinking about the energy security, we have to always take into account the context. So we have to think what, when deciding on the measures, we have to think about the particular context of the situation. So we have to take the historical aspect into account. We have to take geographical, geological, environmental, and sociological aspects also into account. That's why it's so important for the Commission, when the Commission propose a new proposal, to take into account also the provision and also the requirement that comes from the IAEA better lawmaking, to check also the impact on particular regions. It's called territorial impact. It was clearly underlined in the IAEA better lawmaking, and sometimes I feel like that common practice before the IAEA better lawmaking was to evaluate the impact only for EU as a whole. It was very often that the Commission just checked what will be the impact for the EU as an organization, of the EU as a community, never checking what will be the impact for the particular member states or the territories or the regions or even the small communities Alexandra mentioned. So, and a very clear example is the Commission proposal supplementing climate law by adding this emission reduction by at least 55% by 2030. There is no impact assessment so far presented to this particular change. There was the initial impact assessment to the climate law proposal, but the Commission so far, as far as I know, didn't show any impact assessment for the 55% by 2030. So it's unclear what is behind, what was the reasoning of the Commission behind that concept. What was checked? What will be the effect of such a proposal for the member states, for the EU as a whole, but also for the member states and for the regions? One and the last thing I wanted to say about the impact assessment in regard to the European Parliament and the Council is that the IAEA better lawmaking also give those two institutions the right to create their own impact assessment when those institutions during the legislative pipeline want to propose the substantial amendments. It's very important because the EP and the Council rather rarely use this power, and this power is granted by the IAEA better lawmaking, and it may be followed by the request of the Commission to prepare an impact assessment for the substantial amendment proposed by the Council or EP, but also Council and EP may prepare their own impact assessment. And this is very important for the Council and for the EP to more often use this opportunity also in such an important legislation like the one under the just transition. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Martin. A very impressive checklist that you gave here for the legislator. I'm not sure whether this makes lawmaking under the Green Deal any less complex, but maybe reducing complexity is anyway just an illusion, and we should really take into account the situation of not only member states but regions and territories down to the level of detail that you suggested. I would like to continue the discussion, and you saw our poll in the meantime, I believe. A clear majority of colleagues here participating is indeed in favor of giving the spirit of solidarity a rather non-spiritual reading, so a more hardcore legal reading. But let's continue maybe in the sphere of politics. And of course, Andres, you will excuse that you are always addressed when it gets political. But let's remain on the topic of solidarity and decarbonization. So solidarity and also reaching targets, a relatively new approach in the EU, to some extent copied, but also being preceded by and to the Paris Agreement. I throw some provocative statements at you, and maybe you react to that. So the principle of solidarity in the context of achieving decarbonization targets could be an excuse for individual countries not living up to the standards that they would have to live up were they under individually binding targets or obligations. And another statement often heard is that this would turn into nothing else than a transfer union. Any reaction from your side to such statements, Anders?
Well, early next year will be rather interesting situation, because we will have this period 2020 by 2020. So they have been goals, and what concerns renewable energy, they have been legally binding goals for each and every member country. It's also true that during the discussion with member countries, we used what impact it will make for each particular member country. It's definitely modeling, but still, each of them took this obligation well knowing the consequences, or at least anticipated the consequences. Legislation has been flexible enough. It's also saying, well, you could invest in renewables, you can invest in energy efficiency, you could also buy transfers from another if it's cheaper for you. And my understanding is that some member countries will not achieve it. And then there is a big political decision for the Commission what action to do. Because this was asked for me, what you would do as Commissioner when the member countries will not reach the target. And my answer said, well, they will reach. It's low-hanging fruit, no problem with this. But now it's a hard reality. Because if we go further on, if there is a binding target of 55% for each particular member, well, for union as a whole, or whatever it will be for renewable energy, then you could address the issue related to climate and energy plans and effort sharing regulation. Because effort sharing regulation is again binding by a target to each particular member country. And that is a point that you need to address. If you have not reached the target, and you have not adopted your energy and climate plan, then you are legally, in my opinion, you need to be answerable for this. So that means that Commission could have a case against you in this. Should Commission use this power will be seen from this renewable energy targets. My advice is mixed. I have no strong opinion in it, because as a union as a whole will reach this 20% target. So perhaps, just mock exercise would be good, because if we continue like further, it's definitely that there will be some countries that will take more effort to achieve the targets, or they have subscribed themselves, and some will be less. That could you receive already now from energy and climate plans. And Commission has a power to suggest it. So I believe this next year is rather crucial. But in a general approach, for solidarity we started, we have following this approach, because Martin mentioned taxonomy regulation. There is do not harm principle is in it. Solidarity is actually, first of all, this, and then you can perhaps build more on it. So my opinion is that EU is moving in this direction of solidarity. It's not something completely falling out of the sky. I hope very much that the judgment will be upheld. But even if it's not, I think that's brought this thinking in the union, and it should be there as a mainstream thinking.
Thanks a lot. I think this was very important to also, once again, after the Opal judgment was, of course, a welcome occasion to review the entire policy and maybe also legislation of the European Union in areas concerning decarbonization, but beyond. And we will actually discover that the principle of solidarity has been in there for a long time. Maybe it will get a boost, but as you said, it's not that the wheel was reinvented, but we are moving into that direction, and that is probably not good news, but good reconfirmation of what we somehow already knew or felt, and especially given that this decarbonization, this energy transformation undertaking is such a serious and such a profound one that it is actually just not possible to achieve without any element of solidarity. I would like to come back to something we already touched upon, or we discussed actually, that is, was Stefan's contribution, also on the area of, or the overlap between energy poverty and solidarity. Energy poverty, as we said before, got indeed a new attention through the Green Deal, and was already to some extent addressed by legislative measures. There are elements of fighting energy poverty, of exercising solidarity, as Andres may say, in the clean energy package. And I would like to ask Stefan the question, how difficult is it to legislate in the area of energy poverty, or with a objective to fight energy poverty? Actually, what is your experience? Maybe the clean energy package can be an example on which you would discuss, but in general, is that possible to harmonize in the EU the fight against energy poverty, and if yes, to what extent?
So thank you again for these interesting questions. I think what the clean energy package did was quite revolutionary. It brought in the term energy poverty in a whole range of legislative provisions, and also foresaw a whole range of secondary follow-up measures that are themselves having an impact and agency, and we've seen that in the follow-up with both the Green Deal communication, with the renovation wave communication, and also now more recently with the European Commission issuing specific guidance around energy poverty. So a lot of cogs in the wheel have started turning in a way that was absolutely unthinkable. I mean, I've been working on this field a long time, and in 2009, we really struggled to just get that one word in the third energy package, and it just was in one directive. And I should say, even when it almost unnoticed kind of crept in, I think it had giant agency. Just that term started to then create a sort of series of discussions, conversations. It started causing people to think differently and then act differently, also from a maybe legal and regulatory standpoint. I think there are several challenges ahead. So going back to the discussion that you were just having on the Green Deal and just transitions, if I look at what the renovation did and the renovation wave did, and what the Green Deal, all of the policies that we've seen in this year, they're extremely technical and technological. It's all about improving buildings. It's all about targets, very specific technological targets. And I think that in itself is a real challenge, because we are trying to solve what is essentially a kind of social problem, or a policy problem, through infrastructural interventions alone. Not that they're not required, because it's an intersectoral problem, but there's a fundamental issue of exclusion here of, it's poverty, and you can't just solve it through technical measures alone, although we know that energy inefficient homes are a large part of the problem. Having said that, the reason why we have energy inefficient homes is not simply just because those homes exist there. It's because of specific policy and regulatory and legal failures that those homes exist in that shape. So we need to take that into account. So I think that's one of the challenges. Now, moving forward, I think it's going to become really difficult to get any more specific than we already have in the actual legislation. And the reason why is because when you talk about poverty, it's a question of social contract as to what we mean by poverty. So there is a minimum requirement around energy, and it's a form of material deprivation we're primarily talking about here, not necessarily income poverty. There's a minimum requirement that allows people to live a healthy life, not to become ill and end up in hospital or with all kinds of comorbidities because of living in a cold home or a damp home and so on, or a very hot home now with summers. But beyond that, the level of energy that is needed to maintain participation in society is a question of a social contract. How many hours of, do you need a television? Do you need a mobile phone? Do you need an air purifier? Do you need a drying machine? How much should you run it? All questions of a social contract. And then deciding what is needed and what is necessary and so on then becomes a matter of each particular member state. It becomes very difficult to legislate at the EU level around anything like this. So I think we're probably reaching the limits now of what can be done in terms of specific legislation. Where I think there is room for improvement is in the domain of data collection. And surprisingly, you might not know this, but data collection around these questions has been rolled back by Eurostat in recent years. So we now will have less data instead of more, particularly around summer cooling. So data collection is the key thing, and also decision-making capacity, I think generally, and decision support is really crucial at the member state level, so that member states can make these decisions. Ultimately, we might decide that what is needed is a kind of absolute poverty line at the level of individual member states, rather than relative poverty lines. But this is something that will remain to be decided in the future.
Thanks a lot. That brought us already to the limits, maybe also of solidarity, and maybe also of this, the limits of this vision that everything can be handled or let's say centrally in a transition steered top down. I think we're also aware of this, but it's very interesting to see this backed up by very concrete examples and experience in the sphere of fighting energy poverty. I would like, before we go to questions from the audience, one last question, or maybe it's a round or question to which several participants can answer. It goes first of all to Alexandra, and Martin was already mentioning that Stefan as well, how technical sometimes the notion of just transition then can become when you look at it in its very specific ramifications and areas where it's applied, and it can also become a very financial notion. Sometimes you have the impression when looking at the news that the Green Deal generates that just transition, and I'm referring now to just transition funds and just transition mechanism is mostly an accounting term. It's mostly about the number of billions that you get there. We again have the impression that this is not the case, but maybe also from your perspective and with your experience, Alexander, what's the philosophy behind the philosophy beyond the numbers and the figures? And maybe that's also something that other panelists would like to come into.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dirk. Well, I think the financial aspect and the investment aspect is, of course, very important because a lot of investments will need to be done over the coming decades to decarbonize the energy system. We all know that we have done incredible progress in decarbonization of the power sector, but still 75% of the emissions come from energy. So in order to really fully decarbonize, this will get more and more challenging, and we identified the investment needs, and they will be tremendous. But at the same time, a lot of these investments would have to be made anyway in a number of member states, either because the power generation assets are already quite old, as is the case in a number of Central and Eastern European member states, also because a lot of the assets are already running at a loss. So actually, they would have to be replaced with some modern technologies. I just would like to take this opportunity to remind a little bit the fundamentals, with market fundamentals within which we are operating, and these have changed also tremendously over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, coal was the cheapest source of electricity generation in most of the member states. Today, renewables are by far the cheapest source of electricity generation. So the environment within which we are operating has changed, and we also have to take that into account when we discuss solidarity, because the starting point of the European Green Deal is that this is a growth strategy. This is bringing investments and jobs. And the reason why we have introduced the just transition mechanism is exactly because we are looking at the distributional impacts, and we are aware of the fact that some communities will find it more challenging. And just a precision that we have already published the impact assessment on the climate target plan of at least 55%. That was done mid-September. And is already on the Commission website. We haven't provided member state analysis for a very simple reason, and I think Andris Piebalgs was also referring to this. Choices now will have to be made in specific legislative tools that will implement this target, whether it's the effort sharing regulation, the ETS, the renewables directive, on how exactly to implement it. And depending on the scenario that you take on the implementation of these specific tools, the distributional impact on the member states will change. But nevertheless, we know that there will be impacts on coal and carbon intensive regions. And that's why this proposal for the Just Transition Fund has been made. So, Dirk, I think you're absolutely right. The euros that we put into it and the billions are important, but having had the experience of traveling to many of those coal regions, what has been extremely important for them is to finally appear as an item on the agenda for European policy debates, and to get a forum within which they can get together and discuss how do you do this in practice, because in the end of the day, a lot of these regional presidents or mayors are really the first interface of the just transition beyond the national governments. And it has proven to them extremely useful to be able to compare notes, to also realize that this is not just, for example, an Eastern European issue, that this is actually a challenge that is being tackled in Europe, but also beyond. And I think we will be coming to these beyond Europe conversations much more in the future, especially now that we know that China is committed also to going carbon neutral, that we know that South Africa has taken the same commitment. We already hear from our partners around the world that they are interested in what we're doing in Europe, and they also Western Balkans and Ukraine, on which we are cooperating with the Energy Community Secretariat. So this goes, I think, well beyond distributing €500 million here and there, even though it will be important. I think there is much more to gain for these regions also in then selling their hopefully successful transition models overseas. But just to final word on the billions of euros and how we are distributing different funds, I would like to also clarify, and I'm sure that some of you already know that, but it goes well beyond the Just Transition Fund. The Just Transition Fund is a new fund. Let's see what's going to be the size of this fund. In the end, it's still being negotiated by the co-legislators. But we also shouldn't remember that we have over 300 billion euros in cohesion policy, that we have over 600 billion euros in the recovery and resilience facility, and that across MFF and Next Generation EU, 37% of these funds have to be spent on climate targets. There's also the modernization fund, which is starting from next year. So let's look at all these funds and options for support together. And let's also not forget that this is, in the end of the day, about people and citizens living in those communities. And there is also an important role for social dialogue and for member states to ensure that this is locally owned, and there are limits to what we can do from Brussels. And we have to all be working towards the same goal, which I am sure we are.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra. That already sounded like the best possible final words that one could have, but they are not. But I think what you said deserves highlighting in several respects. One is that also the European Union, I believe, made new experience in a dialogical way of tackling issues of solidarity, of just transition, the ones that you described, and that actually you very much promoted in the context of coal regions in transition. I could imagine this was also new lessons learned from Europe, for Europe, and for the Commission as well. Which will be very important in taking this thing forward. And that you also mentioned the possibility for Europe to export some of its experiences to other regions in the world that make similar or face similar issues. That's also very important. But maybe that would be the last question to everybody now. And I see that panelist Andres is already interested to come in. We have been talking about solidarity in the context of just transition over the last hour, and the question would be, we've been also looking at different instruments. We've been now touching upon finance. We were talking about legislation, harmonization. We were talking about adjudication. We were talking about solving issues or addressing issues of solidarity by ways of dialogue, maybe also going under the surface of member states, commissions, dialogue, etc. What, in your view, is the best way to tackle or to actually implement the solidarity principle best in the context of a just transition? I think that's a final question. A short answer by everybody would be great. And then we turn to the questions that have been collected in the meantime in the chat. Thank you. Maybe, Andres, you start?
Well, you really ask questions that is very difficult to answer. Yeah, so I will go just on a couple of aspects that I saw before. Basically, solidarity means a fair relationship. Let's take an example. If EU would like to have minimum standards for quality of work, well, let's take Polish plumber case, yeah. Then the issue is also, well, for energy poverty, we should have the same level. We can't say that in one member country, then somebody should have lower standard for access to energy services than in another country. So the whole solidarity moves, it's a fairness. You take your decision, but you really should not harm. And I believe where the more risky area is actually towards individual households in individual persons, because there we have well, for example, in my own country, we have no definition for vulnerable customer and energy poverty, but I have a figure for how many percent are in energy poverty. It's based on some calculations. But when you speak with people for transition, climate transition, the argument for, I would not call them climate change skeptics, are exactly energy poverty. They say, well, you drive people in energy poverty. And then I say, well, they're energy efficiency, energy. They say, well, if you live in big block house and then their people have different interests for insulation, how you force them to insulate? So I believe that's where actually is the biggest focus for solidarity, because it's social solidarity towards them. And unfortunately, we can't come forward with a new concept like a universal basic income, because energy poverty is a form of overall poverty. But you need to address this issue as consistent as possible, because if you are not being consistent and clear in answering this, you lose in public debate. You lose in public debate because it's misused. It's like, well, a very famous person said, well, you know, you have a lot of fires, it will be cooler. Don't worry, it will cool down. That is not an argument, but it sounds great. And that's exactly the same. Well, people will suffer. Who will suffer? The most vulnerable will suffer. And then you should be capable. No, it's not true. We have mechanisms in the EU in place that makes this solidarity towards individual household, and nobody is left out in this process. So I believe that's where the biggest challenge is, because member countries are doing in different ways. That's their right. But at the end of the day, the whole process of decarbonization, 2050, it's the whole union is carbon neutral. So that means each of us on each our households takes part in this process, and we can't neglect them.
Thank you. Who's next? Stefan? Marcin?
Okay, so Stefan, please.
Go on.
Okay, thank you, Stefan.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I may, just a short comment to what Commissioner Piebalgs said. This is what is most important in this whole energy transformation, is to work on all the different levels of cooperation. It's not only for the institutions somewhere in Brussels, in Berlaymont, to think about the idea. It's not for the institution in member states, but finally it goes to, and it comes to the final consumer, vulnerable consumer. It comes to energy poverty, which Stefan mentioned. Sometimes we hear even some constitutional tribunals from different member states that think about giving a right to energy as a fundamental right, as a human right. So it's very important for the process to be absolutely transparent, especially for the ones in the end, in the end of the pipeline, in the end of the electricity cable, to make this process absolutely clear, absolutely transparent, and fully understandable for everyone. So it's very important what Commissioner said, that this social solidarity, this is the most important in the whole process. Thanks.
Stefan, and then Alexandra, and then we turn to questions and answers, of which we have several.
Just a really quick intervention. I think we have to be careful not to understand solidarity only in terms of distribution. I mean, it is important that, of course, the goods and bads are distributed equally, and that we have an equal distribution of the benefits of low carbon transition, and also addressing the challenges of low income households. But I think really the question of procedure is absolutely vital. The ability of households who are excluded, people who are excluded, groups who are excluded in regions, to have access to justice, to be able to challenge the decisions of decision makers, to be able to challenge the decisions of companies, to be able to participate in the process democratically is absolutely vital. Also, solidarity as a principle of recognition, I think, is really crucial. We are only now beginning to see and understand, through all of this data gathering that we're doing and so on, who is vulnerable, and new forms of understanding around who's, we're beginning to see, for example, big issues around gender, which weren't previously recognized, or ethnicity, which weren't previously recognized. And so, in fact, these new forms of recognition need to come into the debate into who is vulnerable. So I hope the debate, insofar as it goes further, is not just concentrated on the distributions of goods and bads, not, of course, negating that that's really important as well.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Yeah, I think just moving beyond the just transition when it comes to coal and carbon intensive regions, I think it's absolutely right what was mentioned also in these summary comments that energy poverty will play a very important role in how the citizens see the fairness of the European Green Deal and of the transition in general. We will be looking, and it's mainly to do with the issue of heating. And of course, we will be looking into extending the EU ETS into the heating sector, and this will have a huge importance for the fairness of this process. Just maybe finishing on energy poverty, if we take what the Clean Energy for All Europeans package has suggested, that there are, let's say, 3 dimensions to energy poverty. One of them is energy efficiency of dwelling, or poor energy efficiency of dwellings, of houses, high energy bills, and in parallel, low income of households. As part of the Green Deal, we definitely have energy efficiency of buildings as a top priority, and we have recently published the renovation wave, which has a specific focus on energy poverty. And when it comes to the high bills, I think it is clear that all the energy transition is motivated by reducing the cost of this transition as much as possible. And if we are proposing solutions such as the energy system integration, market tools, it's because we are very much aware that this transition has to be affordable, has to be done at a reasonable cost. So I think what is an interesting outcome or conclusion from this debate, at least for me, is that this fairness or the justness and the solidarity aspect within the Green Deal transition and transition towards climate neutrality is not only seen within the regional and community perspective, but also very much at a citizen level, and that the issue of heating and energy poverty will be playing an increasing role. So I think that's already a very good outcome of this discussion, putting so firmly energy poverty alongside other just transition considerations.
Thank you so much. I think we have come back from a debate that has taken us into details of energy poverty, of judicial reasoning and decision making in the EU, of heating and cooling, to something that has occupied mankind since Aristotle, and probably even before. What is just and what is justice? And that's evidently a question that this panel has brought many new elements, or at least elements from a very particular experience and a challenge, and that is how to transform Europe into a decarbonized economy and society. But it's also a question that we will never answer with any finite statement, and that's also how it should be. I may remind that we have a final poll, and that question goes: do you think the mechanisms put forward by the EU for a just transition are viable/fair? It's going to start now, and those of you who have not asked questions or who have already asked their questions should participate. And for that, so for summarizing the questions and putting them to the panel, I would move the camera to my colleague Rosetta, who is sitting here next to me. Here you see her, and she will summarize some of the questions that came through the chat.
Okay, so before turning to the questions, maybe we just look into the answers to the second polling question. And most of the participants, as for the first one, answered yes. So the mechanisms put forward by the EU are viable and fair. And minority think that there is a need and possibility for improvement there. Now looking into the questions, there are several, and of course we have only 10 minutes for 10 questions, which I think is quite difficult. So I will try to be a bit selective and go through the different groups of questions. For the first one relates to the solidarity and the energy poverty again relation, and here Professor Bužarovský expressed the wish to answer. So maybe very briefly, do you see the role, and how do you see the role of solidarity in balancing the accessibility and affordability? So very briefly on this, and then we turn to another one.
Yeah, so the person who asked the question emailed me in the meantime because they can't attend, so I've actually answered to them by email. But I think very briefly, I'm skeptical about that trilemma as it is now. I think it's primarily referred to fossil fuels. In the low carbon transition, we can overcome the trilemma in many ways by integrating energy systems. So the security question isn't really the same. And also, I mean, it's a very long discussion, so I don't want to get into the discussion. But put briefly, in many ways, the solidarity principle connected with the idea of a just and low carbon transition overcomes the trilemma in that classic sense, because we are no longer talking about the importation of fossil fuels from resource rich to resource poor regions. So I mean, again, it's a longer discussion, and I don't want to take the time, but that's sort of
okay. Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, I mean, solidarity as a principle has a role to play even in this direction, and of course, the link with energy poverty and affordability is clear. Which makes the balance then more difficult. Then maybe let's, since this is also an event attended by participants beyond the European Union, there was also an interest in few words on bringing solidarity and what does it mean for beyond European Union, so for countries like the Energy Community, and what kind of role they could play, but also how they could be supported to participate to the just transition. So maybe Alexandra, if you want to say a few words, and then maybe Andres or some of the other speakers.
Yes, sure, and thank you for this question. I think it is very necessary to have the dialogue with the energy community countries on energy transition in general, the European Green Deal, and more specifically on just transition, because of the increasing interconnections and the increasing integration of those countries within our energy market. So there's of course a different case of Ukraine and the Western Balkans. They have different, let's say, perspectives or paths for discussing their future relationship with the EU. But in any case, it is important to have this dialogue, and we are extending the just transition work, perhaps not the just transition fund, which is an EU tool established under the cohesion funds, but the dialogue by establishing an initiative for Western Balkans and Ukraine on just transition, and already next year we will have a dedicated secretariat for that purpose. Already this year, Minister of Climate of Poland, Mr. Kurtyka, has launched a twinning initiative between Polish coal regions and Ukrainian coal regions to learn from each other's experiences about transition. We will also be launching an academy, a coal transition academy that will allow a good flow of best practices and experiences from this just transition. So this is very much a priority and something that we are already planning to do, and I think the importance of this cooperation will only increase in the future as the market is more integrated.
Okay, and then maybe a final one, because we are approaching towards the end of our seminar, maybe a final question, and this maybe Andres would like to come in on this. As you mentioned, the markets are getting more integrated, and then there was a question related to what about the impact of judgments such as the Opel judgment, the solidarity principle, but also within the context of the competences of the EU, and the impact in particular on the Commission's decision in the antitrust, so in the competition area. do you see that judgments such as the Opel one would have an impact on what kind of decisions and cases the Commission is going to pursue in the energy sector in the competition area, having in mind also, of course, the ongoing discussions and the interlinkage between competition and regulation, let's say in the digital area? Do you see something similar also in the energy sectors?
Well, a lot of issues, for example, third package was strongly influenced by competition law. And I think there are two tendencies that we will continue to follow. One is decarbonization, another one is integration of energy markets. And it will not be straightforward procedure. It will be based on cases, because all European legislation is built on compromises, and some issues are not well addressed. Even in specific secondary legislation, you could find that you need to read the whole article, and then part 1 says something different than part 2. And at the end of the day, there will be court case sooner or later that will make some interpretation on this. So I believe that we need to follow these tendencies. We should not be worried that particular cases will destroy the movement, because you are going in this direction very clearly, but it should be fair transition, and fair transition is always related, at least me as a East European, that the rule of law, that you need to have legal certainty, that you need to have confidence in the process, and that is created by legal structures, sometimes slow, but it's the only way.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very optimistic. So we heard from the Commission about their plans, and their using the solidarity through the Green Deal, and you as a true European. We heard how the energy poverty has increased, and maybe Marcin, you would like to come in on this, the impact either of the Opel judgment on this interlinking the markets, and what kind of impact it would have. And also there was another question linked to this, so it's the solidarity versus the rights of the member states to provide for their own energy needs and to select their energy mix. So again, related to the different objectives, and concluding words from your side.
Thank you, Rosetta. I'll be very brief, as we are very close to the end. From my point of view, just like the Commissioner said, we will expand this solidarity principle more and more. This cooperation will be bigger and bigger. Of course, we will use this solidarity principle not only in legislation, but also it will be raised by entities, by energy firms in regard to questioning decisions of for example, national regulators. Just like it was in an Opel case. So we all have to think, I mean, the institutions on the member state level, institutions, and also entities, we have to think about this particular principle. Maybe I will use this opportunity to ask another question which was asked, and I see, which is very, very interesting and show the cooperation between the member states. There is a question, what kind of international instrument should be used, legal instrument should be used to make an agreements between the member states in the field of energy? This is a very interesting question. And I would like author of this question to have a look on the SOS, so-called SOS regulation. In Article 13, Para 10, there is an obligation for the member states to conclude a clear solidarity agreements between the member states. The regulation.
Marcin, I'm very sorry. This is a fascinating topic, but we have to wrap up and come to the end of the seminar.
Okay. Okay.
No, I regret a lot, because your answer to that question would have been extraordinarily interesting, but I'm sure we have another opportunity. I would just like to thank you all a lot. It was extremely inspiring, really very interesting, and I think we made good progress in shedding light on the issue of solidarity in the context of just transition, an ongoing debate. And I think Andres Piebalgs wrapped it up in the nicest possible manner for an energy law forum such as ours, and saying in the end, it all boils down to confidence in the rule of law, or at least that plays a very, very big role. In that spirit, I would like to hand back over to Lee Henscher, if she's still there with us. She is, to conclude, and once again, thanks to the panelists, and thanks also to all the participants out there. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for moderating today. I think it was an extremely lively discussion, very fruitful, and lots of new insights coming up. I think it was great we could approach this complex topic from so many different perspectives. And hopefully then, if you want some of these questions answered, perhaps it's possible to keep the chat going. We'll be back again next week, same time, same place, to look at the new climate law, which is indeed, I think, one of the instruments that we talked about today that will have to resolve these fascinating dilemmas. So thank you for the Florence School for putting this on, for Anne-Marie Cahill, who worked very hard to organize this panel. And thank you very much to all the participants for making it a great afternoon, and hope